Part 1, The Entire History of World War I. The Day the World Cracked. On the morning of June 28, 1914, Sarajevo awoke under a pale, golden sun. The streets, winding and narrow, were unusually lively. Shopkeepers arranged goods in neat displays. Children darted between horse-drawn carriages. Flags hung from balconies, fluttering in a warm breeze, celebrating the royal procession that would soon pass through the city. It was a day like any other, and yet, as history would soon remember, it was unlike any other that had come before. The motorcade rolled slowly through the cobbled streets. Inside the open car sat Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and beside him, his wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg. They were symbols of power, stability, and tradition, yet also of a fragile world that had grown blind to the forces simmering beneath its surface. The Archduke waved at the gathered crowd, his face calm, almost serene. Sophie remained poised, her eyes scanning the street for danger, as though she could sense the tension that was invisible to the rest. For those watching, it was a spectacle. People leaned forward on balconies. Vendors called greetings. Soldiers in polished uniforms marched with precision, standing tall like statues of discipline. Music drifted from a distant brass band, filling the air with celebratory notes. The scene suggested triumph, order, civility. Yet beneath it all, a storm had been quietly gathering. For years, Europe had been a continent of outward progress, railways connecting distant cities, factories producing unprecedented amounts of steel, and an intricate web of diplomacy that promised stability. But appearances were deceptive. Empires, alliances, and ambitions formed a fragile lattice, and the first tremor could shatter it all. The tremor came in the form of a young man named Gavrilo Princip. 19 years old, pale and frail, yet with a resolve that burned hotter than the summer sun, he had spent months preparing for this day. Trained and guided by the Black Hand, a secret nationalist society, Princip believed that only an act of violence could awaken the world to the oppression he saw. The Archduke's visit was a provocation to him, not a celebration, but an opportunity. As the car neared a narrow corner, the first attempt on Franz Ferdinand's life unfolded. Another young man hurled a bomb, but it bounced off the vehicle, landing harmlessly, or almost harmlessly, injuring only bystanders. Chaos erupted momentarily. Soldiers rushed to contain the panic. Citizens screamed and scattered. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if disaster had been narrowly avoided. The Archduke insisted on continuing. He wanted to visit the hospital to see those injured, demonstrating empathy, strength, and resolve. His driver, unaware of the danger, took a wrong turn. The car slowed, attempting to reverse, and fate positioned it directly in front of Princip, who had stepped aside to catch his breath. In that instant, history condensed into two shots. Sophie was struck in the abdomen. Franz Ferdinand was hit in the neck. The Archduke slumped, whispering the name of his wife as the life drained from his body. Sophie's last moments mirrored his own, a shared tragedy of innocence and circumstance. The car sped away, but it was too late. The world had changed irrevocably. At first, few recognized the magnitude of what had occurred. Assassinations, though sensational, were not unprecedented. Royal and political figures had been killed before in Italy, Russia, France, and even the United States. Usually, such deaths stirred outrage but did not topple empires. Yet the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was different. It was not the act alone, but the context and timing that made it an inflection point. Austria-Hungary's leadership interpreted it as an existential threat. The Archduke was the heir to an empire already strained by internal divisions, nationalist movements, and the shifting balance of power in Europe. The act was both symbolic and catalytic. Within weeks, alliances would activate, mobilizations would begin, and the continent would be engulfed in a conflict that no one fully understood, and no one could control. The machine of war, long being primed by ambition, pride, and fear, had been triggered by a single spark, a spark no one could have predicted, yet one that had been quietly smoldering for decades. Europe before 1914, a continent armed for disaster. Before the first shot was fired, before armies marched, before the world was submerged in mud and fire, Europe appeared confident, orderly, and unstoppable. Cities thrived. Railways linked capitals to provinces. Ports buzzed with trade. Factories churned out machinery and steel. Art, science, and literature flourished simultaneously. To the casual observer, Europe had seemingly solved the puzzle of stability and modernity. But beneath the surface, forces of instability pressed relentlessly against the continent. Imperialism was one. The great powers competed globally for colonies, wealth, and influence. Britain ruled the largest empire ever seen, its dominions spanning Africa, Asia, and beyond. France, still smarting from the loss of Alsace-Lorraine decades earlier, sought to assert its place on the world stage. Germany, unified only in 1871, rose with extraordinary speed. Industrial, militarily advanced, and ambitious, it found itself late to the global scramble, resentful and eager to claim its share of influence. Tensions brewed over Africa, Asia, and the smaller nations that served as pawns for greater ambitions. Nationalism acted as an accelerant. In Germany, pride in military might and loyalty to the Kaiser fused into a sense of destiny. In France, nationalism manifested as a mixture of wounded pride and desire for revenge. In Russia, the ideology centered on the protection of Slavic peoples across borders, particularly those under Austrian rule. In smaller nations, like Serbia and Bulgaria, nationalism became a force almost impossible to contain, driving aspirations for unity, independence, and influence far beyond their size. Militarism transformed these sentiments into preparation for catastrophe. Armies expanded, officers gained influence in politics, and war plans became elaborate exercises in control and efficiency. Countries believed that war, if necessary, could be swift, decisive, and heroic. They had not yet imagined the kind of slaughter that industrialized warfare would produce. Generals wrote plans as though chess were played with armies rather than human lives. Mobilization schedules, supply lines, and rail timetables were all crafted to perfection, leaving little room for improvisation when reality arrived. Europe was also entangled in an intricate web of alliances. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed one bloc, the Triple Alliance. France, Russia, and Britain composed the Triple Entente. These alliances were intended to deter war, to maintain peace through mutual obligation. Yet they had the opposite effect. They meant that any localized conflict could rapidly escalate, dragging the entire continent into confrontation. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire had retreated, leaving a patchwork of small, ambitious nations jockeying for position. Serbia, in particular, sought to unite Slavic peoples, while Austria-Hungary tried to maintain control over Bosnia and Herzegovina, lands that seethed with nationalist sentiment. The region became Europe's powder keg, volatile, dangerous, and watched nervously by the great powers. Within Austria-Hungary itself, internal fractures weakened the empire. Multiple ethnicities, languages, and religions coexisted under one crown, but loyalty was fragile. German and Hungarian elites tried to hold power, yet Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, and others increasingly resisted. Nationalism inside the empire was not just a political issue, it was existential. Every act of rebellion, every nationalist demonstration, every rumor of conspiracy threatened the delicate balance of the state. By 1914, Europe was a continent of contradictions. Outwardly, it was powerful, cultured, and progressive. Underneath, it was tense, militarized, and divided. Every empire believed in its own destiny. Every nation feared its neighbor. Every political calculation carried the potential for miscalculation. War, though unimaginable in daily life, had become almost inevitable. And all of it would be unleashed not by an accident of strategy, but by the actions of a single 19-year-old in a quiet Bosnian street. The scene was set. The powder keg was stacked. And the first spark, seemingly insignificant, yet fateful, was about to ignite a war that would reshape the world forever. Part 2: The Assassination and the July Crisis, 30 Days to Catastrophe. The shots fired by Gavrilo Princip were not merely a local tragedy, they were the match that ignited a continent. As the lifeless bodies of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Duchess Sophie were removed from the motorcade, the city of Sarajevo descended into a tense hush. Whispers of fear, outrage, and disbelief spread through the streets. The Austro-Hungarian authorities quickly recognized that this was no ordinary act of violence. The assassin was linked to Serbia, a small yet ambitious nation with nationalist fervor and dreams of uniting Slavic peoples under its banner. To Vienna, the murder represented not just a personal loss, but a profound threat to the stability of an empire already riddled with internal divisions. Inside the imperial palace, the debates were heated. Emperor Franz Joseph, aged, conservative, and cautious, weighed the options: diplomacy or retaliation. Military leaders, long frustrated with cautious civilian oversight, saw only one course: decisive punishment. The generals argued that Serbia must be crushed to demonstrate the empire's strength and to deter other nationalist movements within the multi-ethnic empire. Behind closed doors, they feared that hesitation would be interpreted as weakness, inviting rebellion from Croats, Czechs, and Slovaks. Every hour of inaction increased the risk of losing control entirely. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, alerted to the assassination, responded with what would later be known as the blank check. He promised full support to Austria-Hungary, no matter the consequences. This endorsement emboldened Vienna's leaders. With Germany's backing, Austria-Hungary prepared a carefully worded ultimatum to Serbia, one so severe that rejection seemed almost certain. The ultimatum demanded the right to conduct investigations inside Serbian territory, a blatant violation of sovereignty. It also required Serbia to suppress nationalist organizations within its borders, to remove military officers suspected of aiding insurgents, and to fully cooperate in a way designed to humiliate the smaller nation. Serbia, aware of its vulnerability, attempted diplomacy. Its leaders accepted nearly all conditions, yet balked at foreign oversight of their internal affairs. This partial compliance was interpreted as defiance by Austria-Hungary. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The fuse had reached the powder keg. The ripple effects were immediate and inexorable. Russia, the self-proclaimed protector of Slavic peoples, began mobilization to support Serbia. Germany, perceiving a direct threat to its ally and fearing a two-front war, demanded Russia halt its mobilization. When Russia refused, Germany declared war. France, allied with Russia, prepared its armies, bound by treaties that demanded participation. Germany's plan, the Schlieffen Plan, depended on swift movement through Belgium to strike France before Russian forces could fully assemble. Yet Belgium refused passage, prompting Britain to declare war in defense of Belgian neutrality. Within days, the great powers of Europe were embroiled in conflict, the dominoes falling with terrifying precision. In those weeks, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for reason to prevail. Yet the machinery of war was unstoppable. Trains carried soldiers toward borders, factories churned out arms and ammunition, and political leaders clung to plans they barely understood. The assassination had provided the spark, but decades of tension, ambition, and distrust were the fuel. Europe had entered a war not fully anticipated by its citizens, generals, or kings, a war that would soon reveal the limits of human endurance against industrialized killing. 1914, the war everyone thought would be short. In the early days of August 1914, soldiers across Europe marched toward the unknown with a sense of purpose and honor. Families waved from train platforms. Flags fluttered from windows. Newspapers filled with patriotic slogans glorified duty and courage. Young men believed that within weeks they would return victorious, decorated, and celebrated as heroes. None foresaw the horrors that awaited, none imagined the mechanized slaughter about to consume a generation. The German army, following the Schlieffen Plan, advanced swiftly through Belgium, expecting a rapid victory over France. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force, aiming to knock France out before Russia could fully mobilize. German generals imagined a war of maneuver, decisiveness, and glory. But reality had a different design. Belgium resisted fiercely, its citizens, soldiers, and fortifications slowing the German advance. Britain, honoring its commitment to Belgian neutrality, declared war. The speed and precision the Germans relied upon faltered. Troop movements collided, supply lines stretched thin, and morale wavered. Within days, the myth of a short, glorious war began to crumble. The first major engagement, the Battle of the Marne in early September 1914, marked a turning point. French and British forces, advancing rapidly to intercept German troops, halted the German offensive mere miles from Paris. For the first time, it became clear that the war would not be a swift campaign of triumph, but a prolonged, grinding conflict. The open fields of Europe were about to be transformed into a landscape dominated by trenches, barbed wire, and artillery craters. Movement gave way to stalemate. The Western Front solidified into a static, horrifying line stretching hundreds of miles from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. Soldiers dug in to survive, building intricate trench networks that would define the war for years. No longer would victory be measured by miles gained, but by the ability to endure relentless bombardment, mud, disease, and fear. Despite this grim reality, civilian optimism persisted in many capitals. Governments and newspapers maintained the illusion of a heroic adventure, hiding the slow, consuming agony of industrialized combat. Families sent sons to the front with pride, not fully understanding the scale of mechanized killing that awaited. Soldiers, trained in the tactics of a bygone era, confronted weapons that rendered traditional courage nearly useless. Rifles, machine guns, and heavy artillery reshaped the battlefield, turning every attack into a deadly gamble. The war quickly proved that traditional notions of strategy, honor, and valor could not withstand modern technology. What had been anticipated as a short conflict of maneuver transformed into a drawn-out nightmare of attrition. Europe's armies discovered the limits of human endurance. Commanders discovered the limits of their own planning. And civilians would soon learn that their homes and cities were no longer safe from the reach of modern warfare. The initial months of 1914 exposed the fragile facade of Europe's confidence. Nations that had once imagined war as an orderly extension of politics were confronted with chaos, death, and uncertainty. What had been a continent brimming with pride and progress was now immobilized by fear and exhaustion. The spark of Sarajevo had ignited more than a military campaign, it had shattered illusions, revealed vulnerabilities, and marked the beginning of a war that no one could yet comprehend. Part 3. Life in the Trenches, Surviving Hell. By late 1914, the reality of modern warfare had arrived. The open battlefields that had once hosted maneuvering armies became a shattered wasteland, a labyrinth of trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles. The Western Front, running from the North Sea to the Swiss border, was no longer a place of swift victories, but a landscape of endurance, fear, and death. Men who had once marched with pride now crouched in mud, waterlogged ditches, and hollowed earth, waiting for the next bombardment, the next order to advance, the next wave of machine gun fire. Life in the trenches was a grim routine. Soldiers rose at dawn to inspect their positions, repairing sandbags, reinforcing parapets, and standing watch for enemy movement. Days were punctuated by artillery fire, sporadic sniper shots, and the ever-present threat of surprise raids. The mud, heavy and unyielding, clung to boots, uniforms, and equipment. It seeped into every crevice, carrying with it disease and discomfort. Water pooled in the deepest sections, chilling soldiers to the bone, while rats scurried through the trenches, gnawing on scraps of food and, on occasion, the toes of sleeping men. Lice thrived in the damp, infested clothing and blankets, spreading irritation and infection with relentless persistence. Hunger became a constant companion. Rations, limited and often delayed, consisted of hard bread, canned meat, and whatever scraps could be scavenged. Soldiers longed for the warmth of a home-cooked meal, the simple comfort of a stable life, yet those dreams were perpetually deferred. Letters from home arrived irregularly, bearing news of normalcy that seemed foreign to the trench-bound reality. Every message, every photograph, became a lifeline to a world that existed beyond mud, blood, and the constant roar of artillery. The psychological toll was immense. Shell shock, an early recognition of what we now understand as post-traumatic stress, sapped men's courage and sanity. The relentless pounding of guns, the screams of the wounded, and the omnipresent stench of death eroded hope. Officers sometimes resorted to harsh discipline, executions, or isolation to maintain order, but morale steadily deteriorated as the human spirit strained under unrelenting pressure. Attacks across no man's land, the barren, cratered expanse separating opposing trenches, were exercises in futility. Infantrymen, clad in inadequate protection, advanced over open terrain only to be met by deadly streams of bullets from machine guns. Charges were often slaughtered before reaching enemy lines. Artillery barrages, intended to soften defenses, sometimes killed more attackers than defenders. Survivors carried with them the memory of comrades obliterated beside them, their bodies never recovered, their sacrifices almost immediately obscured by the next wave of violence. Amid this horror, soldiers clung to ritual and routine. Morning roll calls, distribution of food, letters home, and the occasional organized leisure, games, singing, or reading, offered fleeting solace. Friendships became lifelines, comradeship the only barrier against despair. Even so, the monotony of waiting, the endless mud, and the knowledge that death could arrive at any moment formed a slow, suffocating pressure on the mind. Trench warfare revealed the inadequacy of traditional tactics against modern weapons. Human bravery could not overcome rapid-fire guns, explosive shells, and barbed wire. Battles were no longer measured in miles, but in inches of territory gained or lost at staggering cost. The Western Front became a symbol of human endurance against the machinery of death, a theater where courage was tested daily, and the value of life was measured in fleeting hours. Industrialized killing, the machines of death. The war's horror was magnified by the relentless advance of technology. The machine gun, capable of mowing down waves of soldiers with deadly efficiency, redefined defense. What once required hundreds of men to repel an attack could now be done with a single position bristling with firepower. Massed infantry charges became futile, often suicidal exercises. Commanders struggled to reconcile centuries-old tactics with modern killing tools that rendered traditional strategies obsolete. Artillery dominated the battlefield. Shells, fired in unceasing bombardments, reduced trenches, homes, and forests to rubble. The thunder of explosions became a constant presence, a terrifying soundtrack to daily life. Soldiers who survived shelling were often buried in mud, disoriented, or struck by shrapnel. The destructive power of artillery reshaped entire regions, turning towns and fields into landscapes of ruin. The scale of devastation was unprecedented, and its impact on morale immeasurable. Chemical warfare introduced a new dimension of terror. Poison gas, chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas, spread silently through trenches, creeping over barbed wire and into dugouts. Victims struggled to breathe, their eyes and lungs burning, their survival uncertain. Gas masks, introduced to protect soldiers, offered limited defense and a constant reminder of the invisible threat that could claim life at any moment. The ethical boundaries of combat were shattered as technology made suffering systematic. Tanks, new and untested, rolled into the fray. Slow, cumbersome, yet heavily armored, they were symbols of mechanized power. They could traverse barbed wire and withstand small arms fire, offering hope of breaking stalemates. Submarines prowled the seas, targeting merchant vessels and civilian shipping, extending the theater of war beyond Europe and introducing the terror of unseen threats. Airplanes, initially reconnaissance tools, evolved into instruments of death, dropping bombs and engaging in dogfights that transformed the skies into another front. The rapid evolution of weaponry left soldiers and civilians alike struggling to comprehend the scale of industrialized killing. Humanity had created machines capable of annihilating vast numbers in minutes, yet society had no framework for understanding or controlling this power. Traditional notions of heroism, courage, and honor collided with the impersonal, mechanized slaughter that defined the conflict. By combining technology and human strategy, the war transformed into a new entity altogether. Soldiers were no longer the masters of the battlefield, they were components in a larger system, vulnerable to tools that magnified destruction. Each advancement, machine gun, artillery, gas, tank, submarine, airplane, exceeded the capacity of traditional military planning. Human life became secondary to industrial capability. The war was no longer just a struggle between nations, it was an experiment in how technology could shape human destiny, often with catastrophic consequences. The machines of war left their mark not only on the physical landscape but on the psyche of an entire generation. Survivors carried memories of slaughter, destruction, and constant fear. Civilians, witnessing cities flattened and families decimated, understood for the first time that no one was safe from the reach of modern combat. Industrialized killing had transformed war into something permanent, impersonal, and unimaginably deadly, a lesson the world would carry into every conflict that followed. Part 4. The War Beyond the Western Front. While the mud, blood, and barbed wire of the Western Front consumed millions of soldiers, the war quickly proved to be far larger than any single front. In the East, the scale of conflict was staggering, encompassing vast territories where logistics, weather, and geography shaped the course of battles. The Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, where German and Austro-Hungarian forces confronted Russia. The immensity of the terrain magnified both strategic opportunity and operational challenges. Germany faced Russia with a mix of precision and caution. In late August 1914, the Battle of Tannenberg saw German forces deliver a crushing blow to the Russian Second Army. Coordinated maneuvers and effective communication enabled Germany to encircle and annihilate tens of thousands of soldiers. Yet despite such victories, the front remained vast, fluid, and volatile. Russia, enormous in size but struggling with modernization, could absorb losses that would have crippled smaller nations. The conflict here was defined by harsh winters, logistical nightmares, and immense human suffering, as soldiers froze, starved, and fought across endless plains and dense forests. Austria-Hungary fared far worse. Its army, already strained by internal divisions and poorly trained officers, struggled to maintain cohesion. Repeated defeats against Russian forces exposed weaknesses in command and morale. Desertion, poor supplies, and inadequate medical care further eroded effectiveness. The empire, balancing multiple fronts and ethnic tensions at home, was stretched to its limits. The Ottoman Empire entered the conflict in late 1914 on the side of the Central Powers. Its entry transformed the Middle East into a theater of war unlike any Europe had seen. Campaigns in Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, and Palestine drew British, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian troops into fierce combat. The Dardanelles campaign, in particular, became emblematic of human endurance against impossible odds. Soldiers faced rugged terrain, entrenched defenders, and the relentless pressure of modern weaponry, revealing that even the most remote regions were vulnerable to global conflict. Africa and other colonial territories also became battlefields. European powers mobilized colonial soldiers, often coercing local populations into service. Campaigns in German East Africa and West Africa tested endurance against disease, heat, and guerrilla tactics. These theaters, far from the Western Front, demonstrated that World War I was not a conflict confined to Europe, it was truly global, touching continents, peoples, and oceans with devastating reach. The consequences of this widespread fighting were profound. European powers found themselves stretched thin, their resources consumed, their manpower tested. Colonial populations experienced the war both as soldiers and as civilians, bearing the weight of a conflict orchestrated thousands of miles away. Every front reinforced the brutal lesson: modern war was not localized, and no empire could escape the cost of global engagement. Total war, societies consumed. As battlefields expanded, the concept of total war emerged. This was not a conflict fought only by soldiers, it enveloped entire societies, economies, and infrastructures. Civilian populations were mobilized for production, labor, and support, while governments extended their reach to control information, resources, and morale. Factories became the backbone of war efforts. Women, who had long been excluded from industrial labor, entered factories in unprecedented numbers, producing munitions, uniforms, and machinery vital to sustaining armies. They worked grueling hours under dangerous conditions, learning skills previously denied to them, yet contributing to the machinery of death that consumed the continent. Their labor reshaped social structures, yet came at immense personal cost, as the threat of accidents, explosions, and disease loomed over every shift. Food shortages became widespread. Agricultural disruption, blockades, and the diversion of resources to armies created scarcity. Rationing became essential, yet often insufficient. Civilians went hungry, sometimes starving, while cities witnessed inflation, black markets, and desperation. Entire populations lived under the shadow of war, their lives dictated by the demands of frontline armies and government control. Propaganda emerged as a critical tool. Governments controlled newspapers, posters, and public messaging, shaping perception and maintaining morale. Heroic depictions of soldiers, vivid portrayals of enemy atrocities, and calls to patriotic duty were omnipresent. Civilian perception of the war was carefully curated, yet cracks in the illusion were inevitable as casualty reports, letters from soldiers, and first-hand experiences undermined official narratives. Civilians also endured direct suffering from the war's reach. Bombings, sieges, and occupation made homes and cities unsafe. Families lost loved ones in distant fields or within their own towns. Health crises, epidemics, and psychological strain compounded the misery. Nations learned that modern warfare did not respect boundaries, the civilian experience became inseparable from the frontline struggle. Total war consumed economies. Production focused on military needs, diverting resources from everyday life. Governments imposed taxes, requisitioned materials, and conscripted labor, blurring the lines between civilian and soldier. Exhaustion, both physical and psychological, became pervasive. By 1916, it was clear that societies were as much a battlefield as the trenches themselves. In every country, from London to Berlin, Paris to Vienna, the war dictated life. Children grew up with the constant presence of military uniforms and rationed food. Adults labored for survival and victory. Communities were fractured, families decimated, yet the machinery of war pressed on, unstoppable, consuming human and material resources alike. Total war transformed the world, leaving no corner untouched, no life unaltered, and no society unscarred. The combination of global conflict and total war revealed the magnitude of industrialized combat. Victory no longer depended solely on generals, strategy, or battlefield tactics. It required the sustained mobilization of entire nations, the labor of civilians, and the sacrifice of every resource at a country's disposal. Europe, and much of the world, had been drawn into a vortex that would not release its grip for years, leaving a trail of devastation unparalleled in human history. Part 5. The United States enters the war. For the first 3 years of the conflict, the United States maintained a stance of cautious neutrality. Across the Atlantic, the fighting seemed distant, almost abstract, a European quarrel of empires and alliances. Yet neutrality was fragile. German submarine warfare, designed to strangle the United Kingdom's supply lines, increasingly threatened American lives and property. Merchant ships were sunk, their crews lost to the cold Atlantic, drawing outrage from the American public and political leaders alike. Each incident heightened tension, as the United States struggled to reconcile its non-interventionist principles with the imperative to protect its citizens. In early 1917, the Zimmermann telegram escalated matters. Intercepted by British intelligence, it revealed Germany's proposal to Mexico. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico would receive support to reclaim lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The message inflamed American sentiment. What had been a distant war now intruded directly into the consciousness of the nation. Calls for action grew louder, demanding that the United States abandon its neutrality and join the conflict in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson, previously committed to keeping the country out of the war, shifted his stance. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Mobilization began in earnest. Millions of young men enlisted or were conscripted. Factories ramped up production, converting consumer goods into weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The American Expeditionary Forces, commanded by General John J. Pershing, prepared to arrive in Europe, bringing fresh manpower, morale, and resources to the beleaguered Allies. The psychological impact of America's entry was profound. For Allied nations, it offered hope, a reinvigoration of exhausted armies facing years of stalemate. For Germany, it represented a looming new front, the arrival of fresh, well-equipped soldiers with determination and purpose. The balance of power, once thought static, began to tilt. The war, already immense and global, now had a new dimension, the participation of a nation whose industrial capacity and manpower would eventually tip the scales. American involvement also accelerated innovation and coordination. Logistics, medical care, and communications were streamlined to accommodate the influx of troops and supplies. Soldiers trained in new techniques, adapted to modern warfare, and brought enthusiasm that contrasted with the exhaustion of veterans who had endured years of trench and industrialized combat. This infusion of energy and resources would prove decisive in the months to come, reshaping strategies and morale across the fronts. Yet the cost of America's participation was not just military. Societies had to adapt to the demands of total war on a global scale. Resources were diverted to support overseas operations, industries shifted production, and communities prepared for the human toll of conflict. The entry of a new power signaled that World War I was evolving from a European catastrophe into a truly global struggle, one that required the coordinated efforts of nations, civilians, and soldiers alike. Collapse, revolution, and the final gamble. Meanwhile, in Russia, the strains of war proved catastrophic. Years of military defeats, logistical failures, and staggering casualties ignited unrest among soldiers and civilians. By early 1917, the discontent reached a tipping point. Food shortages, economic instability, and the relentless loss of life triggered mass protests and strikes across major cities. The Tsarist regime, led by Nicholas II, faltered under the pressure. Unable to command loyalty, the monarchy collapsed. Nicholas abdicated, leaving a provisional government to govern a nation in chaos. The provisional government, attempting to continue the war effort, faced insurmountable challenges. Soldiers demoralized by years of combat demanded peace. Peasants, emboldened by revolution, sought land reform. Urban workers struggled for better conditions and representation. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power, promising peace, land, and redistribution of wealth. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, formalized Russia's exit from the war. Millions of soldiers were withdrawn, and vast territories were ceded to Germany. The Eastern Front's collapse freed German forces to concentrate on the West, setting the stage for a final gamble. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched the Ludendorff Offensive, a series of rapid, aggressive attacks aimed at breaking the stalemate before American forces could arrive in strength. The offensive initially achieved significant territorial gains. Soldiers, motivated by desperate hope, pushed forward, breaching Allied lines in some sectors. Yet logistical difficulties, overstretched supply lines, and the resilience of Allied forces slowed momentum. Morale began to falter as casualties mounted and victory remained elusive. Across the Western Front, the arrival of fresh American troops injected new energy into the Allied effort. Equipped with modern weapons, trained in the latest tactics, and mentally prepared for the intensity of industrialized warfare, American soldiers bolstered exhausted European armies. Coordinated counterattacks, improved communications, and combined strategies began to reverse German gains. By mid-1918, the momentum shifted decisively. Simultaneously, the Central Powers faced internal collapse. Austria-Hungary, already strained by ethnic divisions, experienced uprisings, desertions, and economic breakdown. The Ottoman Empire, stretched thin across multiple fronts, could no longer maintain cohesion. Germany itself, suffering from food shortages, public unrest, and naval blockades, began to experience the limits of its war effort. Internal dissent, strikes, and protests signaled that the home front could no longer sustain prolonged conflict. By late 1918, the combined pressures of exhausted armies, depleted resources, and political instability forced the Central Powers to seek armistice. One by one, Germany's allies capitulated. Austria-Hungary disintegrated into independent nations. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire signed separate ceasefires. Germany, facing the reality of internal revolution and military defeat, agreed to an armistice on November 11, 1918. The guns fell silent, ending more than 4 years of relentless, global carnage. The final months of the war revealed the limits of ambition, the fragility of empires, and the consequences of underestimating industrialized warfare. Decisions made decades earlier, alliances forged and broken, nationalistic fervor, and the invention of devastating technologies had created a conflict of unprecedented scale. The world had been tested, societies reshaped, and millions of lives irrevocably altered. Victory, though decisive in halting the fighting, came at a cost that would echo for generations. Part 6. Armistice and a Broken Peace. The morning of November 11, 1918, arrived with an eerie calm. Across the scarred landscapes of Europe, soldiers on both sides paused, uncertain if the silence was temporary or permanent. At 11 o'clock, the guns fell silent. The armistice had taken effect. After more than 4 years of relentless bloodshed, Europe was exhausted, its people traumatized, and its cities shattered. The cessation of hostilities was not a celebration, it was a fragile exhale after an ordeal that had pushed humanity to its limits. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Soldiers wandered the front lines, sometimes unsure of their orders, often unsure of what awaited them at home. Cities struggled to accommodate returning troops. Families learned the devastating cost: countless sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers would never return. The psychological toll was profound. Soldiers carried invisible scars, haunted by memories of mud, artillery, gas, and the faces of comrades lost forever. Societies tried to reconcile with the magnitude of destruction, yet relief was tinged with bitterness, anger, and despair. The peace that followed was as fragile as it was ambitious. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, attempted to create order from chaos. Germany, deemed the principal aggressor, faced severe penalties, territorial losses, military restrictions, reparations, and political humiliation. The map of Europe was redrawn. Empires that had dominated the continent for centuries, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Russia's imperial system, and Germany's monarchy, collapsed, replaced by fragile new nations struggling to define themselves. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Baltic states emerged from the ruins of empires, often with borders drawn with little regard for historical, ethnic, or cultural realities. Yet the treaties failed to achieve lasting stability. Punishment and humiliation sowed resentment, and the so-called peace was more a truce that papered over deep divisions. Economic devastation, political unrest, and social upheaval continued to plague Europe. Revolutionary movements emerged, monarchies fell, and new governments struggled to establish legitimacy. The war had altered the political landscape irreversibly, yet the promises of lasting security remained unfulfilled. The civilian population, which had borne the burden of total war, now faced the consequences. Cities struggled with reconstruction. Famine and disease, exacerbated by wartime shortages, persisted. Influenza swept across Europe in 1918 to 1919, killing millions, a cruel coda to the conflict. Societies that had been mobilized entirely for war now grappled with the challenge of returning to peace, often unsuccessfully. The infrastructure of nations had been repurposed for destruction, and the human cost made recovery slow, painful, and incomplete. Armistice and treaty marked the end of fighting but not the end of consequences. Empires had fallen, borders shifted, populations displaced, and economies destabilized. The human psyche, both individual and collective, bore the weight of unrelenting violence. Survivors questioned the purpose of the war, its justification, and the sacrifices demanded. For many, the conclusion of hostilities did not mean relief, it meant confronting the enormity of what had been lost. Legacy, the war that never really ended. The legacy of World War I is a shadow that extended far beyond the battlefields. Soldiers returned home, haunted by memories that would never fade. Entire generations bore psychological scars, the trauma of industrialized killing etched into their minds. Communities mourned, rebuilt, and adjusted to a new reality, yet the echoes of death, loss, and suffering remained omnipresent. Politically, the war reshaped the globe. Old empires collapsed, giving rise to new ideologies and governments. Revolutions, uprisings, and authoritarian regimes filled the power vacuums. Economic instability, compounded by war debts and reparations, fueled discontent and created fertile ground for extremism. The political instability in Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe sowed the seeds for the rise of movements that would plunge the world into conflict again within 2 decades. World War I also reshaped international relations and the perception of war itself. The idea of a conflict fought to end all wars proved tragically false. Nationalism, militarism, and unresolved grievances endured. Countries adjusted their militaries, built alliances, and prepared for an uncertain future, learning hard lessons from the unprecedented scale and scope of destruction. The psychological impact on societies was matched by the physical transformation of landscapes. Cities, towns, and countrysides bore the marks of bombardment and trench networks for years, as Europe physically and emotionally attempted to heal. The technological innovations of the war, from machine guns to chemical warfare, changed military doctrine forever. Warfare had become industrial, mechanized, and impersonal. Humanity had created tools of destruction that could annihilate millions in months, a realization that shaped both military strategy and collective conscience for generations. Lessons learned in mud, blood, and steel reverberated across future conflicts, influencing how nations thought about preparation, deterrence, and the management of industrialized violence. Culturally, the war transformed art, literature, and society. The disillusionment of soldiers and civilians manifested in poetry, novels, and paintings. Modernist movements captured the trauma, horror, and absurdity of a world unprepared for the scale of destruction. The war was memorialized not only in stone and monuments but in memory and imagination, a constant reminder of what humanity was capable of when ambition, nationalism, and technology converged in deadly ways. Yet perhaps the most haunting legacy is the reminder that one moment, 2 bullets in Sarajevo, could ignite forces far beyond imagination. Alliances, pride, imperial ambition, and technological innovation had created a fragile equilibrium, and when it broke, it brought catastrophe. World War I became a cautionary tale of how modern civilization could be undone not by a single nation, but by a complex web of decisions, ideologies, and inventions that humanity could not fully control. The war left millions dead, empires destroyed, and societies transformed. It altered borders, languages, and national identities. It redefined the human experience of conflict and reshaped the moral, political, and psychological landscape of the 20th century. Its lessons, bitter and enduring, remain embedded in history, that the machinery of destruction, once unleashed, is difficult to contain, that human pride and ambition can trigger catastrophes beyond comprehension, and that peace, fragile and fleeting, requires vigilance, wisdom, and restraint. As the guns fell silent, the world looked upon the ruins and understood, in the most profound and painful way, that history had changed forever. One assassination, one spark, had revealed the fragility of nations, the power of technology, and the vulnerability of humanity itself. And in that silence, the world began to reckon with the consequences, not just for 1918, but for generations to come.